The Nissan Murano isn't a very interesting car. It's just a generic Japanese crossover SUV that, in my opinion at least, is very ugly. But we're not talking about the ugliness of the Murano. No, we're talking about another version of this crossover SUV that might catch your eye. What I'm talking about is the Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolet, a 3-door crossover SUV which, as its name implies, has a retractable, soft-top roof. This makes the car twice as ugly as it already was originally, but also makes it much weirder. These cars are what we'll talk about today. Completely regular cars with weird and often interesting versions. The first car we'll talk about today is the Opel Zafira, the first generation to be specific. An entirely normal MPV whose only real purpose is to transport big families from one place to another. And that's where you'd be wrong about the Zafira. One day, engineers at the German company decided to experiment a little bit with the Zafira by shoving a 2-litre turbocharged straight 4 into the engine bay. This gave the family-friendly minivan a breath of fresh air. With a total of 197 brake horsepower, Opel began to sell this new version of the Zafira as the Zafira OPC. While it wasn't the speediest of cars, with a top speed of 137 miles an hour, Opel could claim that it was the world's fastest people carrier, as it had no competition. Despite the car's strangeness in the fact that it's a sports MPV out of all things, Opel continued to produce it through the Zafira's second generation, and even sold it as a Vauxhall in the UK, where Opel doesn't offer its products. Once the Zafira entered its third generation, Opel decided to discontinue the OPC sub-brand and all the cars made by it, including the Zafira OPC. That's too bad, because the Zafira OPC was pretty cool, and despite belonging to a niche, was somewhat popular, I guess. Oh well, let's move on. Our next car is another hot variant of a vehicle you and me know very well. At least I think you know very well. I'm talking about the Volkswagen Passat, the B5.5 generation to be specific. Many people tend to think of this generation of the German family saloon as the best of the Passat line. During the time when VW produced the Passat B5.5, the company decided to make a rather strange version that you may not know about. It was the Passat W8. This was just a Passat with a couple of things changed. All these changes have to do with the engine, which, as the Passat W8's name implies, is an engine with 8 cylinders arranged in the shape of a W. The Passat W8 is unique in the fact that it was the only car ever made to have such an engine. This car had quite great specs, with the engine measuring around 4 litres and packing 270 horsepower at most. This was VW's attempt at making the Passat a powerful luxury saloon. However, VW's attempt didn't really end up working. This version of the Passat was only sold between 2003 and 2005, with only around 11,000 units made. That makes the Passat W8 by far the rarest variant of the German saloon, and also by far the most valuable. Nowadays, the Passat W8 is only really considered a collector's item and nothing more. The Passat W8 was still very cool nonetheless. I'll also quickly mention a version of the Touareg SUV that also happened to have a W layout engine, that being the Touareg W12, with a 6-litre engine packing 444 horsepower and 442 pound-feet of torque. This was the most powerful iteration of the big German SUV until the release of the Touareg R. With all that said, VW had quite the talent to make fun cars with unique engines. And these aren't the only two vehicles to have W layout engines. There were also a couple of Bentleys, the Phaeton, and most Bugattis, with the latter having big fat W16 engines. As much as I'd love to talk more about these cars, we have to move on. Moving on, we have a vehicle that you've probably never heard of, but in order to start talking about it, we have to talk about the Mini Clubman, the first generation to be specific. Introduced by BMW to the Mini range around the same time as the second generation hatch, the Clubman was designed as a more spacious sibling to the 3-door hatch, with enough room for 4 people and much more boot space. This obviously made the Clubman a perfect car for smaller families that wanted something slightly bigger than the hatch. Now, with all that said, what I really wanted to talk about was this, the Mini Clubvan. This was the Clubman stripped of rear passenger space and a boot, which were replaced by 860 litres of cargo space. Despite being a small car, that is surprisingly much when compared to some passenger vans, even those made today, such as the Fiat Cubo, which only had 330 litres of boot space without folding seats. Now then, outside of that, the Mini Clubvan was really just a generic panel van. This was odd coming from BMW, who before making the Clubman never made a single commercial vehicle. And since the Clubvan was unceremoniously discontinued after 2 years of production in 2014, BMW hasn't and most likely will never make one again. You may wonder why this happened, and well, I guess the most obvious reason is because of the sales numbers. In North America, only 50 were sold while it was offered there, and in the last year of the Clubvan's lifetime, only 694 were sold in total, and so the Clubvan's story ends with not the best ending. Oh well, what can we do about it? Now here's another weird variant of another car, that being the Mercedes R63 AMG. Dang, that's a long name. Released in 2007, the R63 was a performance version of the company's chunky luxury MPV called the R-Class. The R63 was powered by a hand-built 6.2 litre V8 that produced a massive 503 brake horsepower that, combined with an all-wheel drive powertrain, allowed for a top speed of 155 miles per hour. That wasn't very much for such a great amount of horsepower, and that's mainly because of the car's weight and size. This chunky MPV, combined with the engine, weighs a grand total of nearly 2.5 tons. This didn't mean that the R63 wasn't quick, however. The car could go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in around 4 seconds, which somewhat makes up for the car's rather low top speed. Even though the R63 was fast, the idea of a hot R-Class didn't really catch on, and so it was only sold for one model year, with only around 200 being made. This makes the R63 by far one of the rarest modern Mercedes models ever. This also means that it would be a miracle to see one on the road. Another reason for the R63's failure was its poor handling. With all that said, I'd love to own one in the future, because despite its odd appearance, the R-Class, and by extension the R63, is in my opinion a rather cool car. With all that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked this video, and if so, why not like and subscribe. This is Autofill here with you. See you later.